Political and economic tensions in Venezuela are pushing oil prices higher. This week, the Trump administration backed Venezuela's National Assembly leader, Juan Guaido, after he declared himself the country's interim president. It comes after Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro severed ties with the US. The crisis has raised concerns that the US could extend sanctions on Venezuela to its energy sector. Joining me now is Dr. Steve Hanke, Professor of Applied Economics at the Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, Baltimore. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, we know the US has already administered sanctions on Venezuela, but not on the energy trade specifically. So is that where the Trump administration is heading?
I think there's a pretty good chance that that's where they're heading, because they are inclined to put sanctions on anything that moves any place in the world without really thinking much about it. So I would not be surprised if they impose some sanctions on the oil sector.
So how damaging would that be to Venezuela's economy, do you think?
Not really that damaging. Sanctions usually don't work very well and have many unintended consequences also, because they're alternatives for Venezuela. They can eventually sell the oil to someone else, and they'll do that. The problem with Venezuela's oil sector is that it's a state-owned enterprise, of course, PDVSA, but the PDVSA is very poorly run. It's probably the worst oil company in the world. They have not maintained the operation well. They've decimated the professional staff and put in political hacks to run the thing. And as a result, already the output from PDVSA, the annual output, is in the range of 1947 levels of output. And the depletion rate is extremely slow. It takes, on average, the average barrel of oil to come out of the reserves that they have, it would be 200 years. At the rate they're pumping, the average barrel will come out of their known reserves in 200 years. Now, to compare that to a major oil company like Exxon depletes their reserves, known reserves, at a rate that, of course, is normal, and it means that after about 8 years, the average barrel of oil is lifted and taken out of the reserve pool.
So several analysts are already predicting a drop in Venezuela's oil output this year, but if the energy sanctions are implemented, how many more barrels of oil output could be lost from Venezuela, do you think?
Well, I don't really have a precise estimate. I haven't made one, but its output is going down because they have not maintained their capital equipment for now almost 20 years. And as a result, the days of outage and breakdown and so on are extremely high in Venezuela. And even if they wanted to produce more oil, which they even do right now, they can't, because they don't have the capacity to do so.
So what would the energy sanctions mean for Trump politically on his home turf? Because we know the Gulf states, the likes of Texas, rely heavily on imported heavy crude to process into fuels. So the US energy sanctions could lead to some kind of a backlash from Republicans, arguably.
Well, that's true. I mean, the refineries in the U.S. that depend on heavy crude from Venezuela, that's a sticking point, shall we say. That would be probably the only thing that would hold back the sanctions that we were talking about. In other words, maybe they won't impose those because of domestic reasons and domestic refineries that depend on that heavy crude. So that's the balancing act, or the trade-off. I'm certain the inclination with the Trump administration is to impose sanctions, because they impose sanctions on everybody for the smallest of infractions. So you could make the argument that they certainly would have imposed sanctions on oil exports from Venezuela long, long ago if there wasn't some resistance to it in America. And the resistance is precisely coming from those refineries.
So what about the price of oil? If we did see these energy sanctions on Venezuela, how much could it push up the price of Brent crude?
That I haven't really calculated up. I mean, already in the last few days, West Texas Intermediate is up more or less $2 a barrel from where it was before the saber rattling started.
So what does this dispute mean for the relationship between the US and OPEC, do you think? Because we know that Venezuela's energy minister is the current rotating president of OPEC this year.
Again, there's so many cross currents there because, of course, the Saudis and other members of OPEC are in bed with the United States in terms of their position and policies in places like Syria. So it's a very mixed, confusing bag. The key thing is Russia. Russia isn't a member of OPEC, and the diplomatic shall we say, explosion could occur between the U.S. and Russia because Russia has already warned the U.S. to stay out of Venezuela. And one reason for that, of course, is that the Russians are in heavily in Venezuela, and particularly in the oil sector itself. So the Russians have a lot of interest in Venezuela, and they don't really want the Americans meddling any more than they already have. We have an unusual situation. You have a president, Maduro, who was elected in really a sham election, an illegal election, and then you have a newcomer on the block who's proclaimed himself president. He didn't even go through the sham of an election. He wasn't elected by anyone. He was basically appointed by the United States. So they have two presidents right now, and they now have even more chaos than they had prior to the dual presidency, shall we say, with in fact neither one of them being legitimate.
Dr. Steve Hanke, thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Good to be with you.
That was Dr. Steve Hanke, Professor of Applied Economics at the Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, Baltimore. I'm Victoria Scholar, and thank you for watching IGTV.